Section 19 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. Chapter 19. The Giant Who Had No Heart in His Body. Norse. Once on a time, there was a king who had 7 sons, and he loved them so much that he could never bear to be without them all at once. But one must be always with him. Now, when they were grown up, 6 were set off to woo. But as for the youngest, his father kept him at home, and the others were to bring back a princess for him to the palace. So the king gave the 6 the finest clothes you ever set eyes on, so fine that the light gleamed from them a long way off, and each had his horse, which cost many, many $100, and so they set off. Now, when they'd been to many palaces and seen many princesses, at last they came to a king who had 6 daughters, such lovely king's daughters they'd never seen, and so they fell to wooing them each one, and when they had got them for sweethearts, they set off home again, but they quite forgot that they were to bring back with them a sweetheart for Boots, their brother who'd stayed at home, for they were over head and ears in love with their own sweethearts. But when they had gone a good bit on their way, they passed close by a steep hillside, like a wall, where the giant's house was, and there the giant came out, and set his eyes upon them, and turned them all into stone, princes and princesses all. Now the king waited and waited for his 6 sons, but the more he waited, the longer they stayed away, so he fell into great trouble, and said he would never know what it was to be glad again. "And if I had not you left," he said to Boots, "I would live no longer. So full of sorrow am I for the loss of your brothers." "Well, but now I've been thinking to ask your leave to set out and find them again. That's what I've been thinking of," said Boots. "Nay, nay," said his father, "that leave you shall never get, for then you would stay away too." But Boots had set his heart upon it, go he would, and he begged and prayed so long that the king was forced to let him go. Now you must know that the king had no other horse to give Boots but an old broken-down jade, for his 6 other sons in their train had carried off all his horses. But Boots did not care a pin for that. He sprang up on his sorry old steed. "Farewell, father," said he. "I'll come back, never fear, and like enough I shall bring my 6 brothers back with me." And with that he rode off. So when he'd ridden a while, he came to a raven, which lay in the road and flapped its wings, and was not able to get out of the way, it was so starved. "Oh, dear friend," said the raven, "give me a little food, and I'll help you again at your utmost need." "I haven't much food," said the prince, "and I don't see how you'll ever be able to help me much, but still I can spare you a little. I see you want it." So he gave the raven some of the food he'd brought with him. Now when he'd gone a bit further, he came to a brook, and in the brook lay a great salmon, which had got upon a dry place and dashed itself about, and could not get into the water again. "Oh, dear friend," said the salmon to the prince, "shove me out into the water again, and I'll help you again at your utmost need." "Well," said the prince, "the help you'll give me will not be great, I dare say, but it's a pity you should lie there and choke." And with that he shot the fish out into the stream again. After that he went a long, long way, and there met a wolf, which was so famished that it lay and crawled along the road on its belly. "Dear friend, do let me have your horse," said the wolf. "I am so hungry the wind whistles through my ribs. I've had nothing to eat these 2 years." "No," said Boots, "this will never do. First I came to a raven, and I was forced to give him my food. Next I come to a salmon, and him I had to help into the water again, and now you will have my horse. It can't be done, that it can't, for then I should have nothing to ride on." "Nay, dear friend, but you can help me," said Greylegs the wolf. "You can ride upon my back, and I'll help you again at your utmost need." So, when the wolf had eaten the horse, Boots took the bit and put it into the wolf's jaw, and laid the saddle on his back, and now the wolf was so strong after what he'd got inside that he set off with the prince like nothing, so fast he'd never ridden before. "When we've gone a bit further," said Greylegs, "I'll show you the giant's house." So after a while they came to it. "See, here is the giant's house," said the wolf, "and see, here are your 6 brothers, whom the giant has turned into stone, and see, here are their 6 brides, and away yonder is the door, and in at that door you must go." "Nay, but I daren't go in," said the prince. "He'll take my life." "No, no," said the wolf. "When you get in you'll find a princess, and she'll tell you what to do to make an end of the giant. Only mind and do as she bids you." Well, Boots went in, but truth to say he was very much afraid. When he came in the giant was away, but in one of the rooms sat the princess, just as the wolf had said, and so lovely a princess Boots had never set eyes on. "Oh, heaven help you! Whence have you come?" said the princess as she saw him. "It will surely be your death. No one can make an end of the giant who lives here, for he has no heart in his body." "Well, well," said Boots, "but now that I'm here I may as well try what I can do with him, and I will see if I can't free my brothers, who are standing turned to stone out of doors. And you too I will try to save, that I will." "Well, if you must, you must," said the princess, "and so let us see if we can't hit on a plan. Just creep under the bed yonder, and mind and listen to what he and I talk about, but pray do lie still as a mouse." So he crept under the bed, and he had scarce got well under it before the giant came. "Ha!" roared the giant. "What a smell of Christian blood there is in the house." "Yes, I know there is," said the princess, "for there came a magpie flying with a man's bone, and let it fall down the chimney. I made all the haste I could to get it out, but all one can do, the smell doesn't go off so soon." So the giant said no more about it, and when night came they went to bed. After they had laid a while, the princess said, "There is one thing I'd be so glad to ask you about if I only dared." "What thing is that?" asked the giant. "Only where it is that you keep your heart, since you don't carry it about with you," said the princess. "Ah, that's a thing you have no business to ask about. But if you must know, it lies under the door-sill," said the giant. "Ho, ho," said Boots to himself under the bed. "Then we'll soon see if we can't find it." Next morning the giant got up cruelly early and strode off to the wood, but he was hardly out of the house before Boots and the princess set to work to look under the door-sill for his heart. But the more they dug and the more they hunted, the more they couldn't find it. "He has balked us this time," said the princess, "but we'll try him once more." So she picked all the prettiest flowers she could find and strewed them over the door-sill, which they had laid in its right place again, and when the time came for the giant to come home again, Boots crept under the bed. Just as he was well under, back came the giant. Snuff, snuff, went the giant's nose. "My eyes and limbs, what a smell of Christian blood there is in here," said he. "I know there is," said the princess, "for there came a magpie flying with a man's bone in his bill, and let it fall down the chimney. I made as much haste as I could to get it out, but I dare say it's that you smell." So the giant held his peace and said no more about it. A little while after he asked who it was that had strewed flowers about the door-sill. "Oh, I, of course," said the princess. "And pray, what's the meaning of all this?" said the giant. "Ah," said the princess, "I'm so fond of you that I couldn't help strewing them when I knew that your heart lay under there." "You don't say so," said the giant. "But after all, it doesn't lie there at all." So when they went to bed again in the evening, the princess asked the giant again where his heart was, for she said she would so like to know. "Well," said the giant, "if you must know, it lies away yonder in the cupboard against the wall." So, thought Boots and the princess, then we'll soon try to find it. Next morning the giant was away early and strode off to the wood, and as soon as he was gone, Boots and the princess were in the cupboard hunting for his heart, but the more they sought for it, the less they found it. "Well," said the princess, "we'll just try him once more." So she decked out the cupboard with flowers and garlands, and when the time came for the giant to come home, Boots crept under the bed again. Then back came the giant. Snuff, snuff. "My eyes and limbs, what a smell of Christian blood there is in here." "I know there is," said the princess. "For a little while since there came a magpie flying with a man's bone in his bill, and let it fall down the chimney. I made all the haste I could to get it out of the house again, but after all my pains I dare say it's that you smell." When the giant heard that, he said no more about it, but a little while after he saw how the cupboard was all decked about with flowers and garlands, so he asked who it was that had done that. Who could it be but the princess? "And pray, what's the meaning of all this tomfoolery?" asked the giant. "Oh, I'm so fond of you, I couldn't help doing it when I knew your heart lay there," said the princess. "How can you be so silly as to believe any such thing?" said the giant. "Oh, yes, how can I help believing it when you say it?" said the princess. "You're a goose," said the giant. "Where my heart is, you will never come." "Well," said the princess, "but for all that, 'twould be such a pleasure to know where it really lies." Then the poor giant could hold out no longer, but was forced to say, "Far, far away in a lake lies an island. On that island stands a church. In that church is a well. In that well swims a duck. In that duck there is an egg. And in that egg there lies my heart, you darling." In the morning, while it was still grey dawn, the giant strode off to the wood. "Yes, now I must set off too," said Boots, "if I only knew how to find the way." He took a long, long farewell of the princess, and when he got out of the giant's door, there stood the wolf waiting for him. So Boots told him all that had happened inside the house, and said now he wished to ride to the well in the church, if he only knew the way. So the wolf bade him jump on his back, and he'd soon find the way. And away they went till the wind whistled after them, over hedge and field, over hill and dale. After they had travelled many, many days, they came to the lake. Then the prince did not know how to get over it, but the wolf bade him only be not afraid, but stick on, and so he jumped into the lake with the prince on his back, and swam over to the island. So they came to the church, but the church keys hung high, high up on the top of the tower, and at first the prince did not know how to get them down. "You must call on the raven," said the wolf. So the prince called on the raven, and in a trice the raven came, and flew up and fetched the keys, and so the prince got into the church. But when he came to the well, there lay the duck, and swam about backwards and forwards, just as the giant had said. So the prince stood and coaxed it, till it came to him, and he grasped it in his hand, but just as he lifted it up from the water, the duck dropped the egg into the well. And then Boots was beside himself to know how to get it out again. "Well, now you must call on the salmon, to be sure," said the wolf, and the king's son called on the salmon, and the salmon came and fetched up the egg from the bottom of the well. Then the wolf told him to squeeze the egg, and as soon as ever he squeezed it, the giant screamed out. "Squeeze it again," said the wolf, and when the prince did so, the giant screamed still more piteously, and begged and prayed so earnestly to be spared, saying he would do all that the prince wished if he would only not squeeze his heart into. "Tell him, if he will restore to life again your 6 brothers and their brides, whom he's turned to stone, you will spare his life," said the wolf. Yes, the giant was ready to do that, and he turned the 6 brothers into king's sons again, and their brides into king's daughters. "Now squeeze the egg in two," said the wolf. So Boots squeezed the egg to pieces, and the giant burst at once. Now when he'd made an end of the giant, Boots rode back on the wolf to the giant's house, and there stood all his 6 brothers, alive and merry with their brides. Then Boots went into the hillside after his bride, and so they all set off home again to their father's house. And you may fancy how glad the old king was when he saw all his 7 sons come back, each with his bride. "But the loveliest bride of all is the bride of Boots, after all," said the king, "and he shall sit uppermost at the table with her by his side." So he sent out and called a great wedding feast, and the mirth was both loud and long, and if they have not done feasting, why, they are at it still. End of section 19, read by Czandra, near Montreal, 2022.
Section 20 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Benjamin Tucker. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. Chapter 20, The Biter Bit. Serbian. From Hero Tales and Legends of the Serbians by Vojislav M. Petrovic. Once upon a time there was an old man who, whenever he heard anyone complain about how many sons he had to care for, always laughed and said, "I wish that it would please God to give me 100 sons." This he said in jest. As time went on, however, he had in reality neither more nor less than 100 sons. He had trouble enough to find different trades for his sons, but when they were once all started in life, they worked diligently and gained plenty of money. Now, however, came a fresh difficulty. One day the eldest son came in to his father and said, "My dear father, I think it is quite time that I should marry." Hardly had he said these words before the second son came in, saying, "Dear father, I think it is already time that you were looking out for a wife for me." A moment later came in the third son, asking, "Dear father, don't you think it is high time that you should find me a wife?" In like manner came the fourth and the fifth, until the whole 100 had made a similar request. All of them wished to marry, and desired their father to find wives for them as soon as he could. The old man was not a little troubled at these requests. He said, however, to his sons, "Very well, my sons. I have nothing to say against your marrying. There is, however, I foresee one great difficulty in the way. There are 100 of you asking for wives, and I hardly think that we can find 100 marriageable girls in all the 15 villages which are in our neighborhood." To this the sons, however, answered, "Don't be anxious about that, but mount your horse and take in your sack sufficient engagement cakes. You must take, also, a stick in your hand so that you can cut a notch in it for every girl you see. It does not signify whether she be handsome or ugly, or lame or blind, just cut a notch in your stick for every one you meet with." The old man said, "Very wisely spoken, my sons. I will do exactly as you tell me." Accordingly, he mounted his horse, took a sack full of cakes on his shoulder, and a long stick in his hand, and started off at once to beat up the neighborhood for girls to marry his sons. The old man had traveled from village to village during a whole month, and whenever he had seen a girl, he had cut a notch in his stick. But he was getting pretty well tired, and he began to count how many notches he had already made. When he had counted them carefully over and over again to be certain that he had counted all, he could only make out 74. So that still 26 were wanting to complete the number required. He was, however, so weary with his month's ride that he determined to return home. As he rode along, he saw a priest driving oxen yoked to a plow, and seemingly very deep in anxious thought about something. Now the old man wondered a little to see the priest plowing his own cornfields without even a boy to help him. He therefore shouted to ask him why he drove his oxen himself. The priest, however, did not even turn his head to see who called him, so intent was he in urging on his oxen and in guiding his plow. The old man thought he had not spoken loud enough, so he shouted out again, as loud as he could, "Stop your oxen a little, and tell me why you are plowing yourself without even a lad to help you, and this too on a holy day." Now the priest, who was in a perspiration with his hard work, answered testily, "I conjure you by your old age, leave me in peace. I cannot tell you my ill luck." At this answer, however, the old man was only the more curious, and persisted all the more earnestly in asking questions to find out why the priest plowed on a saint's day. At last the priest, tired with his importunity, sighed deeply and said, "Well, if you will know, I am the only man in my household, and God has blessed me with 100 daughters." The old man was overjoyed at hearing this, and exclaimed cheerfully, "That's very good. It is just what I want, for I have 100 sons, and so, "As you have 100 daughters, we can be friends." The moment the priest heard this, he became pleasant and talkative, and invited the old man to pass the night in his house. Then, leaving his plough in the field, he drove the oxen back to the village. Just before reaching his house, however, he said to the old man, "Go yourself into the house, whilst I tie up my oxen." No sooner, however, had the old man entered the yard than the wife of the priest rushed at him with a big stick, crying out, "We have not bread enough for our 100 daughters, and we want neither beggars nor visitors." And with these words she drove him away. Shortly afterwards, the priest came out of the barn, and finding the old man on the road before the gate, asked him why he had not gone into the house as he told him to do. Whereupon the old man replied, "I went in, but your wife drove me away." Then the priest said, "Only wait here a moment till I come back to fetch you." He then went quickly into his house and scolded his wife right well, saying, "What have you done? What a fine chance you have spoiled. The man who came in was going to be our friend, for he has 100 sons who would gladly have married our 100 daughters." When the wife heard this, she changed her dress hastily, and arranged her hair and headdress in a different fashion. Then she smiled very sweetly, and welcomed with the greatest possible politeness the old man, when her husband led him into the house. In fact, she pretended that she knew nothing at all of anyone's having been driven away from their door. And as the old man wanted much to find wives for his sons, he also pretended that he did not know that the smiling housemistress and the woman who drove him away with a stick were one and the selfsame person. So the old man passed the night in the house, and next morning asked the priest formally to give him his 100 daughters for wives for his 100 sons. Thereupon the priest answered that he was quite willing, and had already spoken to his daughters about the matter, and that they too were all quite willing. Then the old man took his engagement cakes, and put them on the table beside him, and gave each of the girls a piece of money to mark. Then each of the engaged girls sent a small present by him to that one of his sons to whom she was thus betrothed. These gifts the old man put in the bag, wherein he had carried the engagement cakes. He then mounted his horse, and rode off merrily homewards. There were great rejoicings in his household when he told how successful he had been in his search, and that he really had found 100 girls ready and willing to be married, and these 100 too, a priest's daughters. The sons insisted that they should begin to make the wedding preparations without delay, and commenced at once to invite the guests who were to form part of the wedding procession to go to the priest's house and bring home the brides. Here another difficulty occurred. The old father must find 200 bride leaders, 2 for each bride, 100 cooms, witnesses, 100 staretsvats, 100 kaios, running footmen to go before the procession, and 300 voivodes, standard bearers, and besides these a respectable number of other non-official guests. To find all these persons the father had to hunt throughout the neighborhood for 3 years. At last, however, they were all found, and a day was appointed when they were to meet at his house, and go thence in procession to the house of the priest. On the appointed day, all the invited guests gathered at the old man's house. With great noise and confusion, after a fair amount of feasting, the wedding procession was formed properly, and set out for the house of the priest, where the 100 brides were already prepared for their departure for their new home. So great was the confusion indeed, that the old man quite forgot to take with him one of his 100 ones, and never missed him in the greeting and talking and drinking he was obliged, as father of the bridegrooms, to go through. Now the young man had worked so long and so hard in preparing for the wedding day that he never woke up till long after the procession had started, and every one had had, like his father, too much to do, and too many things to think of to miss him. The wedding procession arrived in good order at the priest's house, where a feast was already spread out for them. Having done honor to the various good things, and having gone through all the ceremonies usual on such occasions, the 100 brides were given over to their leaders, and the procession started on its return to the old man's house. But as they did not set off until pretty late in the afternoon, it was decided that the night should be spent somewhere on the road. When they came, therefore, to a certain river named Luckless, as it was already dark, some of the men proposed that the party should pass the night by the side of the water without crossing over. However, some others of the chief of the party so warmly advised the crossing of the river and encamping on the other bank, that this course was at length, after a very lively discussion, determined on. Accordingly, the procession began to move over the bridge. Just, however, as the wedding party were halfway across the bridge, its 2 sides began to draw nearer each other, and press the people so close together that they hardly had room to breathe. Much less could they move forwards or backwards. They were kept for some time in this position, some shouting and scolding, others quiet because frightened, until at length a black giant appeared, and shouted to them in a terrible loud voice, "Who are you all? Where do you come from? Where are you going?" Some of the bolder among them answered, "We are going to our friend's house, taking home the 100 brides for his 100 sons, but unluckily we ventured on this bridge after nightfall, and it has pressed us so tightly together that we cannot move one way or the other." "And where is your old friend?" inquired the black giant. Now all the wedding guests turned their eyes toward the old man. Thereupon he turned toward the giant, who instantly said to him, "Listen, old man, will you give me what you have forgotten at home if I let your friends pass over the bridge?" The old man considered some time what it might be he had forgotten at home, but at last, not being able to recollect anything in particular that he had left, and hearing on all sides the groans and moans of his guests, he replied, "Well, I will give it to you, if you will only let the procession pass over." Then the black giant said to the party, "You all hear what he has promised, and are all my witnesses to the bargain. In 3 days I shall come to fetch what I have bargained for." Having said this, the black giant widened the bridge, and the whole procession passed on to the other bank in safety. The people, however, no longer wished to spend the night on the way, so they moved on as fast as they could, and early in the morning reached the old man's house. As everybody talked of the strange adventure they had met with, the eldest son, who had been left at home, soon began to understand how the matter stood, and went to his father, saying, "Oh, my father, you've sold me to the black giant." Then the old man was very sorry and troubled, but his friends comforted him, saying, "Don't be frightened, nothing will come of it." The marriage ceremonies were celebrated with great rejoicings. Just, however, as the festivities were at their height, on the 3rd day the black giant appeared at the gate and shouted, "Now give me at once what you have promised." The old man, trembling all over, went forward and asked him, "What do you want?" "Nothing but what you have promised me," returned the black giant. As he could not break his promise, the old man, very distressed, was then obliged to deliver up his eldest son to the giant, who thereupon said, "Now I shall take your son with me, but after 3 years have passed you can come to the luckless river and take him away." Having said this, the black giant disappeared, taking with him the young man, whom he carried off to his workshop as an apprentice to the trade of witchcraft. From that time the poor old man had not a single moment of happiness. He was always sad and anxious, and counted every year, and every month, and week, and even every day, until the dawn of the last day of the 3 years. Then he took a staff in his hand, and hurried off to the bank of the river Luckless. As soon as he reached the river, he was met by the black giant, who asked him, "Why are you come?" The old man answered that he came to take home his son according to his agreement. Thereupon the giant brought out a tray on which stood a sparrow, a turtle-dove, and a quail, and said to the old man, "Now if you can tell which of these is your son, you may take him away." The poor old father looked intently at the 3 birds, one after the other, and over again. But at last he was forced to own that he could not tell which of them was his son. So he was obliged to go away by himself, and was far more miserable than before. He had hardly, however, got halfway home when he thought he would go back to the river, and take one of the birds which he remembered had looked at him intently. When he reached the river Luckless, he was again met by the black giant, who brought out the tray again, and placed on it this time a partridge, a titmouse, and a thrush, saying, "Now, my old man, find out which is your son." The ancient father again looked at one bird after the other, but he felt more uncertain than before, and so, crying bitterly, again went away. Just as the old man was going through a forest, which was between the river Luckless and his house, an old woman met him and said, "Stop a moment. Where are you hurrying to, and why are you in such trouble?" Now the old man was so deeply musing over his great unhappiness that he did not at first attend to the old woman, but she followed him, calling after him and repeating her questions with more earnestness. So he stopped at last and told her what a terrible misfortune had fallen upon him. When the old woman had listened to the whole story, she said cheerfully, "Don't be cast down, don't be afraid. Go back to the river, and When the giant brings out the 3 birds, look into their eyes sharply. When you see that one of the birds has a tear in one of its eyes, seize that bird and hold it fast, for it has a human soul." The old man thanked her heartily for her advice, and turned back for the 3rd time towards the luckless river. Again the black giant appeared, and looked very merry whilst he brought out his tray and put upon it a sparrow, a dove, and a woodpecker, saying, "My old man, find out which is your son." Then the father looked sharply into the eyes of the birds, and saw that from the right eye of the dove a tear dropped slowly down. In a moment he grasped the bird tightly, saying, "This is my son." The next moment he found himself holding fast his eldest son by the shoulder, and so singing and shouting in his great joy took him quickly home and gave him over to his eldest daughter-in-law, the wife of his son. Now for some time they all lived together very happily. One day, however, the young man said to his father, "Whilst I was apprenticed in the workshop of the black giant, I learned a great many tricks of witchcraft. Now I intend to change myself into a fine horse, and you shall take me to market and sell me for a good sum of money. But be sure not to give up the halter." The father did as the son had said. Next market day he went to the city with a fine horse, which he offered for sale. Many buyers came round him, admiring the horse and bidding for it, so that at last the old man was able to sell it for 2,000 ducats. When he received the money, he took great care not to let go the halter, and he returned home far richer than he ever dreamed of being. A few days later, the man who had bought the horse sent his servant with it to the river to bathe, and whilst in the river, the horse got loose from the servant and galloped off into the neighboring forest. There he changed himself back into his real shape and returned to his father's house. After some time had passed, the young man said one day to his father, "Now I will change myself into an ox, and you can take me to market to sell me, but take care not to give up the rope with which you lead me." So next market day the old man went to the city leading a very fine ox, and soon found a buyer who offered 10 times the usual price paid for an ox. The buyer asked also for the rope to lead the animal home, but the old man said, "What do you want with such an old thing? You had better buy a new one." And he went off, taking with him the rope. That evening, whilst the servants of the buyer were driving the ox to the field, he ran away into a wood near, and having taken there his human shape, returned home to his father's house. On the eve of the next market day, the young man said to his father, "Now I will change myself into a cow with golden horns, and you can sell me as before, only take care not to give up the string." Accordingly, he changed himself next morning into a cow, and the old man took it to the marketplace and asked for it 300 crowns. But the black giant had learned that his former apprentice was making a great deal of money by practicing the trade he had taught him, and being jealous at this, he determined to put an end to the young man's gains. Therefore, on the 3rd day, he came to the market himself as a buyer. And the moment he saw the beautiful cow with the golden horns, he knew that it could be no other than his former apprentice. So he came up to the old man, and having outbid all the other would-be purchasers, paid at once the price he had agreed on. Having done this, he caught the string in his hand and tried to wrench it from the terrified old man, who called out, "I have not sold you the string, but the cow," and held the string as fast as he could with both hands. "Oh, no," said the buyer. "I have the law and custom on my side. Whoever buys a cow buys also the string with which it is led." Some of the amused and astonished lookers-on said that this was quite true, therefore the old man was obliged to give up the string. The black giant, well satisfied with his purchase, took the cow with him to his castle, and having put iron chains on her legs, fastened her in a cellar. Every morning the giant gave the cow some water and hay, but he never unchained her. One evening, however, the cow, with incessant struggles, managed to get free from the chains, and immediately opened the cellar door with her horns and ran away. Next morning the black giant went as usual into the cellar, carrying the hay and water for the cow. But seeing she had got free and run away, he threw the hay down, and started off at once to pursue her. When he came within sight of her, he turned himself into a wolf and ran at her with great fury. But his clever apprentice changed himself instantly from a cow into a bear, whereupon the giant turned himself from a wolf into a lion. The bear then turned into a tiger, and the lion changed into a crocodile, whereupon the tiger turned into a sparrow. Upon this the giant changed from the form of a crocodile into a hawk, and the apprentice immediately changed into a hare, on seeing which the hawk became a greyhound. Then the apprentice changed from a hare into a falcon, and the greyhound into an eagle, whereupon the apprentice changed into a fish. The giant then turned from an eagle into a mouse, and immediately the apprentice, as a cat, ran after him. Then the giant turned himself into a heap of millet, and the apprentice transformed himself into a hen and chickens, which very greedily picked up all the millet except one single seed, in which the master was, who changed himself into a squirrel. Instantly, however, the apprentice became a hawk and pounced on the squirrel, killed it. In this way the apprentice beat his master, the black giant, and revenged himself for all the sufferings he had endured whilst learning the trade of witchcraft. Having killed the squirrel, the hawk took his proper shape again, and the young man returned joyfully to his father, whom he made immensely rich. End of section 20.
Chapter 21 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. The Peach's Son, Japanese. From the Myths and Legends of Japan by F. Hadland Davis. One day, while an old woman stood by a stream washing her clothes, she chanced to see an enormous peach floating on the water. It was quite the largest she had ever seen, and as this old woman and her husband were extremely poor, she immediately thought what an excellent meal this extraordinary peach would make. As she could find no stick with which to draw the fruit to the bank, she suddenly remembered the following verse: "Distant water is bitter, the near water is sweet. Pass by the distant water and come into the sweet." This little song had the desired effect. The peach came nearer and nearer till it stopped at the old woman's feet. She stooped down and picked it up. So delighted was she with her discovery that she could not stay to do any more washing, but hurried home as quickly as possible. When her husband arrived in the evening, with a bundle of green upon his back, the old woman excitedly took the peach out of the cupboard and showed it to him. The old man, who was tired and hungry, was equally delighted at the thought of so delicious a meal. He speedily brought a knife and was about to cut the fruit open, when it suddenly opened of its own accord, and the prettiest child imaginable tumbled out with a merry laugh. "Don't be afraid," said the little fellow. "The gods have heard how much you desired a child, and have sent me to be a solace and a comfort in your old age." The old couple were so overcome with joy that they scarcely knew what to do with themselves. Each in turn nursed the child, caressed him, and murmured many sweet and affectionate words. They called him Momotaro, or Son of a Peach. When Momotaro was 15 years old, he was a lad far taller and stronger than boys of his own age. The making of a great hero stirred in his veins, and it was a knightly heroism that desired to right the wrong. One day Momotaro came to his foster father and asked him if he would allow him to take a long journey to a certain island in the northern eastern sea, where dwelt a number of ogres, who had captured a great company of innocent people, many of whom they ate. Their wickedness was beyond description, and Momotaro desired to kill them, rescue the unfortunate captives, and bring back the plunder of the island, that he might share it with his foster parents. The old man was not a little surprised to hear this daring scheme. He knew that Momotaro was no common child. He had been sent from heaven, and he believed that all the ogres and demons could not harm him. So at length the old man gave his consent, saying, "Go, Momotaro, slay the ogres, and bring peace to the land." When the old woman had given Momotaro a number of rice cakes, the youth bade his foster parents farewell, and started out upon his journey. While Momotaro was resting under a hedge, eating one of the rice cakes, a great dog came up to him, growled, and showed his teeth. The dog, moreover, could speak, and threateningly begged that Momotaro would give him a cake. "Either you give me a cake," said he, "or I will kill you." When, however, the dog heard that the famous Momotaro stood before him, his tail dropped between his legs, and he bowed with head to the ground, requesting that he might follow Son of a Peach, and render to him all the service that lay in his power. Momotaro readily accepted this offer, and after throwing the dog half a cake, they proceeded on their way. They had not gone far when they encountered a monkey, who also begged to be admitted to Momotaro's service. This was granted, but it was some time before the dog and the monkey ceased snapping at each other and became good friends. Proceeding upon their journey, they came across a pheasant. Now the innate jealousy of the dog was again awakened, and he ran forward and tried to kill the bright-plumed creature. Momotaro separated the combatants, and in the end the pheasant was also admitted to the little band walking decorously in the rear. At length Momotaro and his followers reached the shore of the northeastern sea. Here our hero discovered a boat, and after a good deal of timidity on the part of the dog, monkey, and pheasant, they all got aboard, and soon the little vessel was spinning away over the blue sea. After many days upon the ocean, they sighted an island. Momotaro bade the bird fly off, a winged herald to announce his coming, and bid the ogres surrender. The pheasant flew over the sea and alighted on the roof of a great castle, and shouted his stirring message, adding that the ogres, as a sign of his submission, should break their horns. The ogres only laughed and shook their horns and shaggy red hair. Then they brought forth iron bars and hurled them furiously at the bird. The pheasant cleverly evaded the missiles and flew at the heads of many ogres. In the meantime, Momotaro had landed with his two companions. He had no sooner done so than he saw two beautiful damsels weeping by a stream, as they wrung out blood-soaked garments. "Oh," they said pitifully, "we are daughters of daimyos, and are now the captives of the Demon King and his dreadful island. Soon he will kill us, and alas, there is no one to come to our aid." Having made these plaints, the women wept anew. "Ladies," said Momotaro, "I have come to the purpose of slaying your wicked enemies. Show me a way into yonder castle." So Momotaro, the dog, and the monkey entered through a small door in the castle. Once inside this fortification, they fought tenaciously. Many of the ogres were so frightened that they fell off the parapets and were dashed to pieces, while others were speedily killed by Momotaro and his companions. All were destroyed except the king, and he resolved to surrender, and begged that his life might be spared. "No," said Momotaro fiercely, "I will not spare your wicked life. You have tortured many innocent people, and robbed the country for many years." Having said these words, he gave the Demon King into the monkey's keeping, and then proceeded through all the rooms of the castle, and set free the numerous prisoners he found there, and also gathered together much treasure. The return journey was a very joyous affair indeed. The dog and the pheasant carried the treasure between them, while Momotaro led the Demon King. Momotaro restored the two daughters of the daimyos to their homes, and many others who had been captives on the island. The whole country rejoiced in his victory, but no one more than Momotaro's foster parents, who ended their days in peace and plenty, thanks to the great treasure of the ogres which Momotaro bestowed upon them. End of chapter 21. Section 22 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. The Man Who Lost His Legs. Korean. From the Korean Folk Tales by M. Bong and E. Ruk. Translated by James S. Gale. There was a merchant in Cheongju who used to go to Quelpart to buy seaweed. One time when he drew upon the shore, he saw a man shuffling along on the ground towards the boat. He crept nearer, and at last took hold of the side with both his hands and pulled himself in. "When I looked at him," said the merchant, "I found he was an old man without any legs. Astonished, I asked, saying, 'How is it, old man, that you have lost your legs?' He said in reply, 'I lost my legs on a tramp once when I was shipwrecked, and a great fish bit them off." "However did that happen?" inquired the merchant. And the old man said, "We were caught in a gale and driven till we touched on some island or other. Before us on the shore stood a high castle with a great gateway. The 20 or so of us who were together in the storm-tossed boat were all exhausted from cold and hunger, and lying exposed. We landed and managed to go together to the castle. There was in it one man only, whose height was terrible to behold, and whose chest was many spans round. His face was black, and his eyes large and rolling. His voice was like the braying of a monster donkey. Our people made motions, showing that they wanted something to eat. The man made no reply, but securely fastened the front gate. After this he brought an armful of wood, put it in the middle of the courtyard, and there made a fire. When the fire blazed up, he rushed after us, and caught a young lad, one of our company, cooked him before our eyes, pulled him to pieces, and ate him. We were all reduced to a state of horror, not knowing what to do. We gazed at each other in dismay and stupefaction. When he had eaten his fill, he went up into the veranda and opened a jar from which he drank some kind of spirit. After drinking it, he uttered the most gruesome and awful noises. His face grew very red, and he lay down and slept. His snorings were like the roarings of the thunder. We planned then to make our escape, and so tried to open the great gate. But one leaf was about 24 feet across, and so thick and heavy that with all our strength we could not move it. The walls, too, were 150 feet high, and so we could do nothing with them. We were like fish in a pot, beyond all possible way of escape. We held each other's hands and cried. Among us, one man thought of this plan. We had a knife, and he took it, and while the monster was drunk and asleep, decided to stab his eyes out and cut his throat. We said in reply, "We are all doomed to death anyway. Let's try." And we made our way up to the veranda and stabbed his eyes. He gave an awful roar and struck out on all sides to catch us. We rushed here and there, making our escape out of the court back into the rear garden. There were in this enclosure pigs and sheep, about 60 of them in all. There we rushed in among the pigs and sheep. He floundered about, waving his 2 arms after us, but not one of us did he get hold of, for we were all mixed up, sheep, pigs, and people. When he did catch anything, it was a sheep, and when it was not a sheep, it was a pig. So he opened the front gate to send all the animals out. We then each of us took a pig or sheep on the back and made straight for the gate. The monster felt each, and finding it a pig or a sheep, let it go. Then we all got out and rushed for the boat. A little later he came and sat on the bank and roared his threatenings at us. A lot of other giants came at his call. They took steps of 30 feet or so, came racing after us, caught the boat and made it fast. But we took our axes and struck at the hands that held it, and so got free at last and out to the open sea. Again a great wind arose, and we ran on to the rocks and were all destroyed. Every one of us was engulfed in the sea and drowned. I alone got hold of a piece of boat timber and lived. Then there was a horrible fish from the sea that came swimming after me and bit off my legs. At last I drifted back home, and here I am. When I think of it still, my teeth are cold and my bones shiver. My 8 lucky stars are very bad. That's why it happened to me. End of chapter 22.
Section 23 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Benjamin Tucker. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. Chapter 23, The Stone Giantess, North American Indian. From The Myths of the North American Indians by Lewis Spence. In bygone times it was customary for a hunter's squaw to accompany her husband when he sought the chase. A dutiful wife on these occasions would carry home the game killed by the hunter and dress and cook it for him. There was once a chief among the Iroquois who was a very skillful hunter. In all his expeditions his wife was his companion and helper. On one excursion he found such large quantities of game that he built a wigwam at the place and settled there for some time with his wife and child. One day he had struck out on a new track, while his wife followed the path they had taken on the previous day in order to gather the game killed then. As the woman turned her steps homeward after a hard day's work, she heard the sound of another woman's voice inside the hut. Filled with surprise, she entered, but found to her consternation that her visitor was no other than a stone giantess. The stone giants were a strange and terrible race, whose bodies were all fashioned of solid stone. They once attacked the Iroquois, meaning to exterminate them completely, but were defeated with the help of the west wind. To add to her alarm, she saw that the creature had in her arms the chief's baby. While the mother stood in the doorway, wondering how she could rescue her child from the clutches of the giantess, the latter said in a gentle and soothing voice, "Do not be afraid. Come inside." The hunter's wife hesitated no longer, but boldly entered the wigwam. Once inside, her fear changed to pity, for the giantess was evidently much worn with trouble and fatigue. She told the hunter's wife, who was kindly and sympathetic, how she had traveled from the land of the stone giants, fleeing from her cruel husband, who had sought to kill her, and how she had finally taken shelter in the solitary wigwam. She besought the young woman to let her remain for a while, promising to assist her in her daily tasks. She also said she was very hungry, but warned her hostess that she must be exceedingly careful about the food she gave her. It must not be raw or at all underdone, for if once she tasted blood, she might wish to kill the hunter and his wife and child. So the wife prepared some food for her, taking care it was thoroughly cooked, and the two sat down to dine together. The stone giantess knew that the woman was in the habit of carrying home the game, and she now declared she would do it in her stead. Moreover, she said she already knew where it was to be found, and insisted on setting out for it at once. She very shortly returned, bearing in one hand a load of game which 4 men could scarcely have carried, and the woman recognized in her a very valuable assistant. The time of the hunter's return drew near, and the stone giantess bade the woman go out and meet her husband and tell him of her visitor. The man was very well pleased to learn how the newcomer had helped his wife, and he gave her a hearty welcome. In the morning he went out hunting as usual. When he had disappeared from sight in the forest, the giantess turned quickly to the woman and said, "I have a secret to tell you. My cruel husband is after me, and in 3 days he will arrive here. On the 3rd day your husband must remain at home and help me to slay him." When the 3rd day came round, the hunter remained at home, obedient to the instructions of his guest. "Now," said the giantess at last, "I hear him coming. You must both help me to hold him. Strike him where I bid you, and we shall certainly kill him." The hunter and his wife were seized with terror when a great commotion outside announced the arrival of the stone giant. But the firmness and courage of the giantess reassured them, and with something like calmness they awaited the monster's approach. Directly he came in sight, the giantess rushed forward, grappled with him, and threw him to the ground. "Strike him on the arms," she cried to the others. "Now on the nape of the neck." The trembling couple obeyed, and very shortly they had succeeded in killing the huge creature. "I will go and bury him," said the giantess, and that was the end of the stone giant. The strange guest stayed on in the wigwam till the time came for the hunter and his family to go back to the settlement, when she announced her intention of returning to her own people. "My husband is dead," said she. "I have no longer anything to fear." Thus, having bid them farewell, she departed. End of section 23.
Section 24 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lauren Anton. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. Part 4. Some Real Giants and What Science Has Learned About Them. And Chapter 24. Some Real Giants. Part 4. Some Real Giants and What Science Has Learned About Them. Giant gods and demigods loom large in the myths of every land, in India, China, and Arabia, as well as Greece and Scandinavia. Many records follow of real giants during the 7,000 or 8,000 years since the first flashes of history. But it needs to be stated at once that here, as in many other matters, exactness of facts is a very modern quality. Thus, when Pliny tells us that Gabara, whom the Emperor Claudius brought from Arabia, was 9 feet 9 inches tall, we can only be sure that he was probably the largest human being in Rome at that time. And a suspicious number of these early tall men were seen through the mist of reverence due to kingly station and power. A notable company these giant kings would make. Sesocris of Egypt, perhaps 4000 BC, who passed for a giant. King Saul, the gigantic youth of the tribe of Benjamin, chosen by Lot to reign over Israel. Maximinus, Thracian shepherd, fierce gladiator, and then savage emperor of Rome, who, Capitolinus declares, was over 8 feet tall, wore his wife's bracelet for a finger ring, could break a horse's jaw with his fist, or outpull a chariot team, and was in the habit of draining a 6-gallon amphora of wine and consuming 40 pounds of meat a day. Harald Hardrada, Viking rover, Mediterranean conqueror, and king of Norway, whose height was 5 ells, 10 feet. Emperor Maximilian of Germany, and many another. A regiment of formidable warriors would follow these rulers, such as the huge grenadiers of King Frederick William of Prussia and of Peter the Great. The Elector of Brandenburg, too, had in the 16th century a famous soldier named Michel, reputed to be 8 feet tall, a worthy descendant of that giant Swabian, another, renowned in the army of Charlemagne, who swam rushing rivers, dragging his horse after him, looked down upon his enemies as little frogs, and would spit several at once like birds on his weapon. Frederick William developed a theory that he could establish a new race of physical marvels by intermarrying his huge guards with women of phenomenal size, and he used to busy himself greatly over such matches. He had little success. The giant as a fighter passed swiftly away before cannon, muskets, and pistols. It was not long before he was merely a prodigy to draw the curious crowd. Chapter 24. Some Real Giants. Let us agree, arbitrarily, that people of from 6 to 7 feet in height are only very tall men, but that those who exceed the 7-foot mark may fairly be called giants. During the last 200 years, there have been over 100 men and women figuring in the public eye who have exceeded 7 feet. Probably 25 of these have had a height of 8 feet or over. In spite of statements in advertisements and handbills and newspapers, even in encyclopedias, there does not seem to have been any human being measured by scientific methods who reached 9 feet. To be sure, one may read in the histories and biographies that the Roman emperors Maximinus and Jovianus and Charlemagne and Emperor Maximilian of Germany were 8.5 or 9 feet, but one cannot measure even live emperors, unfortunately, much less long-dead ones. Many a traveler asserted that he had seen with his own eyes scores of Patagonian savages ranging from 9 to 11 feet, yet as soon as careful measurements were made, these dwindled to a maximum of something under 7, and the vast number of giant's bones, dug up from time to time, indicating men of 9 feet and upward, have practically all been shown to be those of great animals. One of the most notable characteristics about the giant is a certain shrinking tendency before the camera and the tape. In the last 20 years or so, a group of alert savants, especially in France, have been gathering authoritative biological observations upon all the subjects possible, and it is wise to recall that only such exact scientific records can be relied on. For, apart from pride, there is a vast deal of money involved in a few extra inches for the show giant. For instance, Antoine Hugo, announced as the tallest man, died in 1917 after having made quite a fortune in America, and it was stated that a freak promoter would pay a premium of $400 an inch for anyone who could show a greater stature than Hugo. That is to say, he would give nearly $3,000 for a 9-foot giant, besides paying the giant himself something like $1,500 to $2,000 a week. Whereas Hugo's brother, who was only a couple of inches shorter than he, was not in demand in the United States, which calls for only champions in the freak class. Apparently the tallest man on record was Makhnov, a Russian, who was born at Vitebsk about 1882, was exhibited in London in 1905, in the United States, Germany, Holland, and elsewhere, and died around the age of 30. None of his family was exceptionally tall, and he himself was a normal child up to the age of 4. Then he began to grow very rapidly, not eating a great deal, but sometimes sleeping for 24 hours at a time. At 15, he was about 5 feet 2. At 22, according to Professor Luskow and Lisker, he was 7 feet and 10 inches. When he appeared in London next year, he was credited with 9 feet 3 inches, and the most conservative of British encyclopedias accepts this figure. In the show world, he was universally taken as the champion, with a figure of 8 feet 7 inches. It seems beyond question that he was over 8.5 and under 9 feet. His weight was given as 360 pounds. The champion in 1920 was George Auger, credited with 8 feet 4 inches, who is an American and affects frontier costume. Then there was the famous smiling Chinaman, Chang, who exhibited his 8 feet or so to nearly the whole world for a long period, beginning about the end of the American Civil War. A generation back, there were in the 8-foot class the Austrian Winkelmeyer, Paul Marie Elizabeth Weddy, born at Ben Rendorf in Thuringia, who was called the Queen of the Amazons, and was handsome enough to appear with success at the London Alhambra in a revue called Babel and Bijou, Ben Hicks, the Denver Steeple, and, a little smaller, Captain Martin Van Buren Bates of Kentucky, who married in London in 1871 Miss Anna Swan of Nova Scotia, who was 3 inches taller than himself. They were celebrated as the tallest bride and groom in the world, scoring 14 feet 8 inches between them, while the captain's weight of 450 pounds made him a notable figure. Public curiosity regarding the very tall men is by no means modern. 1,500 years ago, a poor giant in Rome was almost killed by the press of people crowding about to get a sight of him. But there was a special outbreak of such prodigies during the 18th century, particularly in England. Footnote: a century earlier came Long Meg of Westminster, heroine of most extraordinary and comical exploits in one of the old ballads. End footnote. 3 of the most celebrated of these were from Ireland. First came Cornelius Magrath, born near the silver mines in Tipperary in 1736. Neither his parents nor their other children were remarkable in size, but when Cornelius visited Cork at the age of 16, a regular mob followed him through the streets, since he towered already head and shoulders above other men. It appeared that the year before Cornelius was much troubled with pains in his limbs, and thinking them rheumatic, he would bathe in salt water for a cure. But they were growing pains of a rare sort, for during that year he shot up some 18 inches. Since this rapid growth caused him partially to lose the use of his limbs, Dr. Berkeley, Bishop of Cloyne, took the youngster into his house for a month or more and had him treated so successfully that he regained his powers. His hand was then as large as a middling-sized shoulder of mutton, which joint he could cover with that member. The last of his shoes, which he carried about with him, measured 15 inches in length. This charity of the worthy bishop was ill-rewarded. There grew up a legend, which got into the newspapers and into Watkinson's Philosophical Survey of Ireland, that Bishop Berkeley, from an inhuman scientific desire to experiment in giant-making, had taken a poor orphan, and by some mysterious course of feeding, had caused him to shoot up to the height of 7 feet. Magrath kept on growing until at the age of 30 he measured 7 feet 8 inches, and he created a sensation in London, Paris, and other European capitals, distracting attention from Giantess, the great Swede, who was taller but not so well proportioned. His body was finally stolen by medical students of Trinity College on the day on which he was to have been waked. This is said to have been the origin of the feud between the students and the coal porters of Dublin, which has continued to this day, 1868. He was a great friend of the students, and he used to raise by the collar of his coat and hold out at arm's length, for a long time, a small-sized student named Hare, who was father of the late Dr. Hare, F.T.C.D. Mr. Hare one day ran between McGrath's legs, and the giant strained himself in recovering his balance, from which accident he failed in health and ultimately died. His skeleton is preserved at Trinity College. Next there came a Cork man, James MacDonald, who was first exhibited, served as a grenadier for 30 years, then became a day laborer and died, according to the annual register for 1760, at the age of 117, which is nearly 3 times the average of giants, either modern or in those, for them, unwholesome days of chivalry. A little later, Charles Byrne, who called himself O'Brien, eclipsed both these notables. He came to London in 1782, as witness this announcement: Irish Giant, to be seen this and every day this week in his large elegant room at the Cane Shop, next door to Late Cox's Museum, Spring Garden, Mr. Byrne, the surprising Irish Giant, who is allowed to be the tallest man in the world. His height is 8 feet 2 inches, and in full proportion accordingly, only 21 years of age. His stay will not be long in London, as he proposes shortly to visit the Continent. The nobility and gentry are requested to take notice. There was a man showed himself for some time past at the top of the Haymarket and Piccadilly, who advertised and endeavoured to impose himself upon the public for the Irish Giant. Mr. Byrne begs leave to assure them it was an imposition, as he is the only Irish Giant, and never was in this metropolis before Thursday the 11th instant. Hours of admittance every day, Sundays excepted, from 11 till 3, and from 5 to 8, at half a crown each person. Poor Patrick had a rather unhappy time of it, in spite of the furor attending his appearance during the short year when he stood as the most extraordinary production of the human species ever beheld since the days of Goliath. He got to drinking, and visiting the Black Horse Tavern one night was robbed of all the fruits of his year's success, which he carried in 2 banknotes, one for £700, one for £70. Then he became so fearful that the surgeons would get his body for dissection that he begged his remains should be thrown into the sea. The London newspapers, during the summer of the consummation of American independence, were agog with wild tales of the plots to secure the giant's body after death. Says one, "The whole tribe of surgeons put in a claim for the poor departed Irish giant, and surrounded his house just as Greenland harpooners would an enormous whale. One of them has gone so far as to have a niche made for himself in the giant's coffin, in order to his being ready at hand on the witching time of night when churchyards yawn." Another tale was that a rival party had equipped itself with diving bells to salvage the prodigy from the river, where it was to be sunk at the Downs in 20 fathoms of water. A third said the undertakers had been offered a bribe of 800 guineas. Whatever the facts, the huge skeleton was for a century a treasured possession of the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. Spurred on by Byrne's reception, Patrick Cotter of Kinsale appeared presently. He also took the name of O'Brien and admitted himself to be a descendant of Brian Boru. He soon eclipsed all rival pretenders, and in the 20 years before his death accumulated a competence. Many were the stories told of him. He used to travel in a carriage built especially for him, with a sort of well in the floor to hold his legs. One evening the carriage was stopped by a highwayman. As Cotter slowly rose to look out, the robber saw this huge figure rising apparently endlessly, and, struck with panic, he dropped his pistol, clapped spurs to his horse, and galloped away. Then he liked to do such things as startle the watchman by reaching up to a street lamp and taking off the cover to light his pipe, or to wager £10 that he would kiss a pretty girl at an upstairs window as he walked past. Some half a century back, a gentleman wrote to one of the magazines that he possessed the giant's gold watch, which weighed 1 pound and had his name engraved in it, and was still in good running order. Rather more interesting than these show giants were the corps of gigantic guards, such as those maintained for half a century at Potsdam by the Prussian kings. Even James I had a doorkeeper, Walter Parsons, about 7.5 feet tall, and Cromwell boasted another, Daniel, of the same size, who became insane from a religious ecstasy. These huge soldiers were gathered with great care from all countries, the tallest being 7 feet 6 inches, and since they were well-built athletic men, they made a most impressive appearance. King Frederick William, says Voltaire, armed with a huge sergeant's cane, marched forth every day to review his regiment of giants. These giants were his greatest delight, and the things for which he went to the heaviest expense. The men who stood in the first rank of this regiment were none of them less than 7 feet high, and he sent to purchase them from the farthest parts of Europe to the borders of Asia. I have seen some of them since his death. The king, his son, who loved handsome, not gigantic men, had given those I saw to the queen, his wife, to serve in quality of headkeys. I remember that they accompanied the old state-coach which preceded the Marquis de Beauval, who came to compliment the king in the month of November, 1740. The late king, Frederick William, who had formerly sold all the magnificent furniture left by his father, never could find a purchaser for that enormous and gilded coach. The headkeys, who walked on each side to support it in case it should fall, shook hands with each other over the roof. A pleasant exception in character was one Anthony Payne of Cornwall, a region always famous for tall men. In fact, the learned author of a History of Oxfordshire in 1676 was strongly of the opinion that a huge Cornish skeleton discovered in his time was that of the famous Arabian giant celebrated by Pliny, Gabara, and that he had doubtless been brought to Britain by the Emperor Claudius. Tony Payne was reputed to measure 4 inches over 7 feet. He was a faithful follower of the Stowe family, as noted for intelligence, vigor, and good humor as for size, and fought with distinction in the royal army during the Great Rebellion. After the Restoration, Charles II had his portrait painted by Kneller. One Christmas Eve, he sent a boy with a donkey to bring in wood from the forest. Going out after a while to look for him, he found the youth loitering along, whereupon Payne picked up the loaded donkey and carried it back to the castle. He lived to an old age and left behind him a reputation for spirit, ability, and loyalty to his ideals, which seems rare enough among physical prodigies. Many historical figures have been at least on the borderline of gianthood. William of Scotland, Edward III, Godfrey of Bouillon, Philip the Long, Fairfax, Baron Barford, Kleber, Rochester, Charles II's favorite, Gaul, Briot Savarin, Benjamin Constant, the painter David, and others were men of quite extraordinary stature. Just how tall we cannot, unfortunately, find out. But the facts seem to be that at any one time one could come pretty near counting on one's fingers all the people in the world who really measured over 8 feet in height. End of section 24. Read by Lauren Anton, Brooklyn, New York, February 12, 2022.
Chapter 25 of A Book of Giants. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier. What Science has Learned About Giants. Nor is this modest 8 feet of stature, after Sir Ferumbras and Angulphara, the most disheartening thing about giants. For the cold-hearted biologists who have specialized on the subject want to steal even the word and make giantism signify a diseased condition. There is, alas, a good deal of justification for this iconoclastic position. The exact observations are not yet numerous enough to enable us to generalize, but it is all too evident that the vast majority of these tallest men and women are suffering from an obscure malady, which produces a disharmony of the bony structures, and also causes various functional disorders. Generally, the giant shows obvious signs of what the pathologists call acromegaly, where there is a great enlargement of head, feet, and hands. We do not know just what causes this abnormal growth. It seems usually associated with the ailments of one of the remarkable ductless glands, the pituitary body, which clearly has some direct connection with the growth of bones and tissues. Oddly enough, many of the characteristics of the giants of legend fit only too well with this modern theory that the giant is diseased. Perhaps, after all, it is just as well that Roland and Lancelot and Amadis and Gaia of Warwick exterminated the poor creatures. We can, for more reasons than one, afford to smile at the solemn French academician who just 2 centuries ago worked out a table to prove the shrinkage of the human stature since ancient times. Said M. Henrion, "Here is the tabular record. Adam measured 120 feet 9 inches. Eve measured 118 feet 9 inches. Noah measured 103 feet. Abraham measured 28 feet. Moses measured 13 feet. Hercules measured 10 feet. Alexander measured 6 feet. Julius Caesar measured 5 feet. And he strove to convince the world that men for their wickedness must have shrunk to nothing at all in a few more centuries. But the appearance of the Messiah during the epoch of the Roman Emperor stopped the degeneration and fixed the normal height at what it then was. However, if our bodies today cannot be more than 9 feet tall at the uttermost, there is no limit on our minds. They can scale the heavens, where the giant brood failed. They can be as lofty as we really desire. It remains quite open to us moderns to be giants in intellect and energy, and true progress and helpfulness toward our weaker brethren. End of chapter 25. End of A Book of Giants by Henry Wysham Lanier.